statement that you don't go to your dentist for a heart problem is certainly a very well taken, and your description of people like Ivor Giever, who's got his information, he says, from the web. We all know how reliable that is. But of course, at the same time, one would think that scientists in general would be better able to assess evidence than the general public, because scientists are trained to assess evidence. At the same time, in support of your point about some scientists saying this, I often say that there is no proposition so outrageous that you cannot find a PhD physicist to assert it. But nevertheless, what I'm wondering is there statistical information about the opinion of scientists as a whole, as opposed to climate scientists and as opposed to the general public, about the influence of human activity on global warming?
Yes, that's a very important question, I agree. And it's certainly not the group of scientists that I show you in the Wall Street Journal. But we know which institutions do we trust. It's a national academies, for example. It's a professional societies, for example. So I'm very familiar with the ones in the United States because I belong to several of them. American Chemical Society is yet another one. But certainly the academies of sciences are in I don't know, in 20, 30 countries and so on, are in total agreement with one way to express it, the results of the recommendations of the IPCC, or with the recommendations of the National Academy of the United States. Okay, so yes, that's one way to do it. Other ways would be to carry out surveys, which is a little bit more troublesome because it depends how you choose the scientists. But to me, that would be a reasonable way to answer your question. Go to the professional societies, go to the national academies that are the respected institutions. And also you can do the same thing, not just for the science itself, if you want, for the economic analysis and so on, and they all seem to approve the consensus, as I explained. Yeah.
I have been submitted to one argument, which is that, and you showed it in one of your slides, which is that in the Middle Ages, the temperature was higher than it is now, say around year 1000, and clearly the CO2 had not begun to increase. Would you comment about this?
Yes, this is very, very well documented in the scientific literature. It's just one example of what I call cherry picking. And there are so many others that I am not going through the details, but in the literature, this goes back to the famous hockey stick sort of graph that Thomas Mann had, and he, by the way, just published recently a book with, for the public, the very detailed analysis of that. So, although I'm not very familiar with all the details, that's not the case. Namely, the entire surface temperature of the planet was not higher than now. It was just a localized event, and CO2 was, of course, measured. We can measure very well from bubbles. It was, of course, also not larger. But this fits very well with the noise in the system, that sometimes you have higher temperatures in some places, sometimes in others. And by the way, much of this is well understood. There are La Niña events, El Niño events, and so there are cycles where temperature goes up in some places. And so there is absolutely nothing striking about the event that you show, and it's well documented in the literature. It's one example, again, of the deck of cards that I showed, because there are several others where somebody finds something wrong, and you can publish it, of course, but it has been very well responded by the scientific community. And again, I remember at least that particular fact. It's certainly not the case that the entire planet was warmer in the Middle Ages. That's just a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the data.
But what was your graph showing? I mean, it was showing the global temperature of the planet.
Yes, and so the global temperature, it has a lot of uncertainties. I don't know if I can show the graph, but this is the graph, by the way, that the IPCC collected. They simply went to different groups and graphed again what the different groups concluded was the temperature in the past 1,000 years, okay? And that, of course, there are proxies. And the three rings had some difficulties. In some places, it was understood why they were not perfect. But then you can go to lake sediments, you can go to ocean sediments, and different groups have some differences. But all of them, as you saw in the graph, all of them conclude that recently, with thermometers, with less ambiguity, the temperature is suddenly increasing at a very fast rate compared to many other geological events. But it might have increased. But again, I repeat, the most striking finding I remember is that there was no evidence of a global surface change. It was mostly just in some part of the northern hemisphere.
Thank you. May I ask a question? In the field of agriculture, the science community is torn between expecting slow movement in mitigation of climate change and the need to adapt crops and ecosystems in the medium run. And my sense, we do a bit of work on these, as the action is rather slow moving on the global recarbonization of biosphere, we have a lot of more support and pressure for adaptation. Would you care to comment? I mean, this trade-off, of course we need both, but this trade-off is tilting more and more towards adaptation and nutrient management, land use management, and it's not just an economic trade-off, but an ecological one.
Sure. Well, a couple of comments, because I want to stress the last point you made. I stressed economics just because that's the bottom line for a number of people in society. But there are, of course, many other aspects, some ethical ones, which is our responsibility with future generations and so on, and the fact that you cannot measure all the damage in dollars. Okay, so to me, there are additional powerful arguments for society to try to change, besides the fact that it's not terribly expensive. But that's just your very last comment. But you are right. There are several things society should be responding to. Well, I essentially talked about mitigation just as one option to solve the problem, which means reducing emissions, and that the best way to do that would be with an economic signal at the planetary scale, okay, like it has happened before with the Montreal Protocol or so. But that's the only example that has worked, by the way. But it can be done. But adaptation is crucial because damage is already happening. And we just saw that with Sandy in New York, okay? They could have, if they had guessed that these sort of events could happen, of course they could have minimized the cost even more. And by the way, it's yet another example that all you can claim is that climate change has made it more likely, and it's not after the fact, but before the fact. The scientific literature was already very clear on that. Another of my colleagues at MIT, Kerry Emanuel, is an expert in hurricanes and so on. So he has been saying for years already that the power of hurricanes depends on the surface temperature of the oceans in a non-linear way. So it's just likely that things will begin to happen that way. But coming back to your point, of course, we should invest in research, in new technologies for energy, but in agriculture as well, for global food security. Particularly if you consider that it's the poorer countries that are even more vulnerable, okay, to floods and to agricultural problems and droughts, okay? You need drought-resistant crops. But just to finish that comment, there's a lot to talk, but one very simple measure, I'm actively working in Mexico and in Latin America, that is just use water for agriculture much more efficiently than you do it now. You see in many of these countries, including Mexico, water and electricity for agriculture are subsidized. So the big owners of agricultural fields, they couldn't care less about using water efficiently because it's just free, okay? So that's, obviously there are lots of things you can do, but you can do a lot of good science. And there again, it'll be nice to discuss with you later, there are some limits. If the temperature goes up above a certain number of degrees, it's hard to imagine how you can actually develop sort of with genomic engineering or whatever plants that will resist such high temperatures. But you can certainly do lots of research to improve the situation, okay? And yeah, I know there are more questions. I forgot one comment because I'm looking at an empty seat there, Professor Tsikiki. He was one of the co-signers of the Wall Street Journal. I just thought I mentioned that.
I have one clarification. You know, what is the present status of understanding of the carbon dioxide absorption by the oceans?
Yes,
and
okay.
The question of some of the things that have been going on now under the, what you call it, the geoengineering,
Right.
which in one of the experiments in Indian Ocean,
Right.
they tried to do the phytoplankton increase by iron filings.
Right.
What do you think of some of these kind of suggestions that are coming forth, particularly in the broader context of the geoengineering?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of questions, and there's a lot of information, so I'm just summarizing, and I'll be glad to talk to you more at length afterwards. But first of all, the fate of carbon dioxide as it's emitted is reasonably well understood, but with uncertainties. The relatively recent findings, Susan Solomon, a good colleague of mine that actually recently moved to MIT, she and her colleagues, the paper, which is sort of blessed by the National Academies, in which the finding is worrisome, namely, we know roughly half the CO2 is rapidly taken up by the oceans and by the fields. The other half remains. Some of that doesn't last very long, but some other part, maybe 20, 30% remains more than a millennium. Okay, so the worry is that what we're doing has a very long-term impact. And you can measure these things. So it's not just speculation. You can measure how much is it increasing, and it's reasonably well known how much society is emitting because just from fossil fuel calculations, okay? Now, there's another big problem I didn't mention, which is, yes, the oceans take up significant amounts, and again, how rapidly the oceans mix is one of the variables that matters a lot. But ocean acidification is yet another independent large problem because you're affecting the ecology of the oceans already in very significant ways. In terms of this adding iron, you know, in English, sometimes you call it a geritol solution because geritol is a medicine that people take that has iron for that. The point is that's very risky. And the marine biologists and biologists like Penny Chisholm, again at MIT, I'm biased by MIT because I spent so many years there, but she's certainly one of the world's experts here. And she was very worried because she thought that would cause, that would have strong secondary effects. And in fact, it's not very efficient. A lot of the iron sinks. So it's not a very good solution. There are other better solutions. Geoengineering in general is controversial. It's easier to reduce emissions, but perhaps the best suggested geoengineering solution is our chairman, Paul Crutzen, suggested just by copying volcanoes. When you have an explosive volcano that injects sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, the planet cools about 1 degree or 2 with Pinatubo and so on. So you could do that under controlled conditions. This should be a plan B, okay? We should have it there should be scientific analysis just in case, but if we can at all manage to avoid that, we would be safer. There's one more question. Yeah.
I would like to point to an analogy, because we are discussing analogies here, which is striking to me. Looking at your figures of 97% of scientists in the climate area being convinced that this is real and only 3% not. Looking at genetic engineering with plants, we have an identical situation. Mm-hmm. We have probably 97% consensus that there is nothing special risky with transgenic plants, and a minute minority of the opposition, which finds all the attention of the media and of the politicians, and has led to a situation that this technology cannot be used for public good. So what are the powers behind this analogy?
Yes.
I see another personal analogy. You obviously are badly frustrated about your attempts to convince the public that what you are defending is real and should be considered seriously. I have the same frustration in our area. So if you are discussing analogies, this is not a scientific analogy, but this is a political analogy. Yeah. Would it be worse to discuss this kind of analogies as well?
Well, let me first make a comment, because I find it very interesting. I certainly agree. But to me, what's interesting about your analogy is that it's working sort of in the opposite direction in terms of what you think environmentalists are. Okay, so the criticism to the group of climate scientists that think that we should worry about this is, oh, these are tree huggers or people that just want to protect the environment, even if it's damaging the progress of society. Okay. Really, what we're showing that we don't think that's the case. It's the other way around, because the damage is there already. But you can certainly exaggerate. And your example is a very good one. And there are some NGOs that tend to exaggerate the other way. And so you have to be careful. But the point that I can stress with that example is the following. In the scientific community, we are always, in general, very worried and very careful about not exaggerating, okay? So you give all sorts of explanations and so on, and that's not a very efficient way to communicate things to society, okay? So we have suffered a little bit from that. I remember the very first press release, just to finish very quick, that I had on the ozone layer. Eventually, that problem was solved with the Montreal Protocol, but the very first press release, Paul Crutzen was part of that, of course, and Sherry Rowland, who passed away a few years ago. We were so worried, we said, okay, let's explain to the press how things are happening. So we're going to start telling them what are CFCs, how are they accumulating, and then at the end we'll tell them, look, we have a problem. Well, it was a 10, 15-minute press release. 2 minutes after we started, all the newspaper people were gone, okay? So you have to tell them the bottom line initially, and we just have not to exaggerate. We have to be honest, but we have to tell them something that is understandable anyhow. Okay.
Sorry, one last question. I know that we are not time, but many, because you are a great authority, of course, also because you are from Mexico, but many environment specialists in the question of the environment, we don't know what is the idea that these people have about the OGM food.
About what?
OGM food, transgenic food.
GMOs, right.
That is very important, also for the economists.
Right.
For example, we have in the other academy Stiglitz, and we don't know exactly, because don't say exactly what is his talk about this. What is your opinion?
Yeah, okay. With the GMOs and so on, I remember because many years ago I was asked to be in one of the first panels that were going to see what to do about this. There was very little information about that. I remember my own advice is, well, let's just be cautious, and in principle you can actually design organisms that are very dangerous, okay? So the technology is there. So let's just make sure that society is aware of that, and you have some sort of control so that you don't have crazy people doing crazy experiments. But if you have that in mind, and you are now making some new plant forms that are more likely to succeed and to support climate change and so on, by all means, I think that's quite reasonable, because this happens naturally anyhow. Okay, these sort of selection systems, you can of course do it much more rapidly now, much more intelligently, but people after all have been doing that. You know, one extreme example, at home I have some little dogs, Chihuahuas. They come from wolves, okay? And people are the ones that have selected them. So it's how? Well, it's essentially the same system. Of course, you can do it faster and better and so on, but just be cautious, and by all means, you should do things that are in the benefit of society, and let's just avoid crazy people doing crazy experiments, that's all. Okay, coffee.
We can go
Sorry
to
for-
coffee break.